and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we're going to be kicking off our Integrated Pest Management mini-series with Dr. Thomas Green. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, is a system by which pests are controlled using informed decision-making techniques such as pest monitoring and pest thresholds instead of regularly scheduled pesticide use. Holistic IPM takes things to the next level beyond that, incorporating economic, social, and other advanced systems into the decision-making process. This episode, Tom's going to be walking us through all things IPM, including facets of Holistic IPM, techniques, success stories, and future research. Thank you to Kellogg Company for sponsoring this episode. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Thomas Green with us. Tom is the co-founder and current board president of the IPM Institute of North America, working with farmers, food companies, and communities since 1998 to improve sustainability. Tom holds a PhD in entomology, is a certified crop advisor, and operates green pest and tick control, serving residential, multifamily, and other sensitive environments in Wisconsin with natural and low-risk solutions to structural and landscape pest problems. After 22 years, he stepped down from his role directing the IPM Institute in 2020 and remains on the board. He also serves on the boards of the Maryland Pesticide Environmental Network, the Heartland Health Alliance and Protected Harvest, and the Science Advisory Council for Field to Market. Hi, Tom. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks.
Wonderful. We are so glad to have you on the show today. We are talking about holistic integrated pest management today. So to get started, can you just give us an overview of integrated pest management, or IPM, as we'll probably call it for the rest of the show? Holistic IPM, like what is it? What's the difference between those two terms, if any? The history of this? Just tell me all about it.
Sure. So integrated pest management, or IPM, is all about taking informed action to manage pests based on what's happening in the crop rather than a routine or calendar basis. So when I started working in agriculture back in the early 1970s, I was managing an apple orchard, and in the winter, your pesticide salesperson would come along with this calendar that would tell you what you would be spraying each week of the growing season. With IPM, we don't do that, so we might use a monitoring trap, like a sticky red croquet ball for apple maggot, and then check that trap every week and not apply any pesticides if there aren't apple maggot flies on the trap. The other important piece of IPM is that the question is not, whether you're doing IPM or not, but really how much IPM are you doing? So you might be scouting, which is checking plants or traps, and spraying only when you find pests. That's basic IPM. Or you might be looking at the whole farm holistically and asking, so why do we have these pest problems? And trying to figure out how to address those root causes, and perhaps planting a different crop every other year that doesn't provide food for those pests. And that dry season for those pests causes those populations to crash, and so you don't have them the following year. And planting flowering crops around the field, or plants, non-crop plants around the field that won't be harvested, but that provide habitat and nectar for beneficial insects that help keep the pests in check. So holistic pest management has really been around for decades, and it refers to looking at the whole system. So economics, behavior, social aspects, and trying to design a system that works for the farmer, who is really the important person at the center of the system. And that's very important to be successful, that you address what the farmer needs to get out of the IPM program. And there's been a recent book that came out by Juan Barrera called Beyond IPM that does a great job describing holistic IPM and gives some good guidance for people as they're developing IPM programs so that they keep those elements in mind.
And you mentioned in some of our back and forth before the call that holistic IPM has kind of been around since it has started to be more of a thing since the 70s. And can you tell me more about kind of the origins of like why did we start to switch? I mean, in hindsight, it's maybe a little more obvious why we decided to switch to some of these different techniques. But like, what kind of instigated this change and movement?
Sure. So IPM really evolved in the 1950s and 60s and started to be used as a term in the early 1970s. And it was in response to problems that we were having with a pesticide-focused approach. So in the 40s, there was a lot of work done on nerve agents for warfare, for example. And in peacetime, it was found that a number of those chemicals could be used to control pests in ag fields. And it was the silver bullet, and overnight yields were improving because we were wiping out pests and essentially keeping the crop land sterile during that growing season. But cracks in that approach soon emerged, and I'm sure many of the listeners have heard about Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which described some of the problems that we were having. And by the early 1970s, we had less than 100 mating pairs of bald eagles left in the lower 48 states. And pests were no longer being controlled by some of these chemicals. If you expose a population of pests to the same chemical time and time again, sooner or later there's going to be a mutation that comes along in an individual and that will get passed along because that mutation allows the individual to survive that pesticide application. And so before long, you have all these resistant pests that are no longer affected by the pesticide, and you have to move on to a different pesticide if you're staying in that pesticide-focused mode. So IPM was developed really to respond to those issues that we were having, and it's just a common sense approach, and it's used now widely, not only in agriculture, but also it's how we manage pests in our buildings and our lawns and landscapes as well, and should be. Rather than applying pesticides on a regular basis, we should be looking to see what's going on our lawns or in our buildings, and we can do so much to keep pests out of buildings and deny them access to food and water that we can manage pests in buildings with very little pesticide.
Yeah, so we've got IPM in general and holistic IPM, which is kind of this next level or more advanced techniques that really takes into consideration more aspects or facets of these than regular IPM would. Can you tell us more about some of the considerations that you mentioned before? Some that you mentioned were maybe social or economic, behavioral, financial. Can you talk more about what are some of the aspects that holistic IPM takes into consideration that basic IPM wouldn't, and what you're looking at when you take those things into consideration?
Sure. So as you mentioned, holistic IPM really is on the advanced end of the spectrum of IPM practices. And while we do need those basic IPM elements for sure and research on those, for example, like developing specific thresholds for individual pests, mites on strawberry plants, for example. We need to know how many mites or how many infested leaves is too many where it will start to affect the value of the crop and action needs to be taken. So that's That's a basic IPM technique, developing that threshold so that growers and scouts can go out, count the mites, decide whether we need to treat or not. And holistic IPM includes developing and applying those basic IPM elements, but also takes into account the broader issues like farmer behavior. So how risk averse is that farmer? Some farmers might have a large operation. They can spread the risk out over many fields. They could afford to take the risk of waiting another week to see if the predators knock down that population of mites below that threshold. A smaller farmer might not be able to take that risk, and so they might be treating either by making an application of beneficials into that strawberry field or making a pesticide application into that strawberry field a week earlier than that large farmer. So holistic IPM is taking into account those economic issues that those two different farmers face and that behavioral profile too. So how much risk is a farmer able to take? On a larger scale, with holistic IPM, we might look at potato crop, for example, and potatoes are a crop that benefit from a long rotation, which means that you don't plant potatoes every year, but you plant them every 3 or 4 years instead. And that dry period when there aren't potatoes present helps suppress insects and diseases in those fields. And you can plant crops in those intervening years that also help you manage weeds. So most potato farmers are growing in a 3 to 4 year rotation. But in order to do that, you have to have profitable crops that you can grow in those middle years. And so in some cases, an IPM program could be developing the infrastructure that you need and the markets for those crops that you're planting in those intervening years so that growers can be profitable growing potatoes and get the benefits from those intervening crops as well as the pest management benefits from rotating those potatoes with those other crops.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? The American Society of Agronomy and Certified Crop Advisor Program are hosting 5 IPM webinars between December 2020 and April 2021 to coincide with this mini-series. The American Society of Agronomy's magazine, Crops and Soils, will also be publishing 3 articles on related IPM topics. If you'd like to learn more about any of these resources or related continuing education unit opportunities, you'll find links to them in our show notes. If you're a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can also take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, I find this topic really fascinating because I think it just points again to the issue that things are a lot more nuanced than I think the average consumer might consider. I'm saying that as someone without an ag background who definitely falls under the average consumer category. So not to disparage anyone, but I think for me, like, when I would think of a farm, I'd be like, yeah, like there's probably bugs out there, but like, other than that, like everything is as clean and immaculate, maybe some extra dirt, but otherwise like as clean and immaculate as you would expect to find in a store. But it's like, there's all of these interconnected pieces that I'm just really fascinated by, including, some of those social aspects of being risk averse or the financial aspects and decisions that farmers have to make, which are obviously quite difficult to make. But I do want to talk more about these techniques in some success stories. So can you tell me what have been some of the positive results that we have seen in moving towards this more holistic approach?
Great. Well, I'll talk about 2 examples. one that I have colleagues that have worked on and familiar with through hearing about their work, and that's cotton in Arizona. And then I'll talk about apples in the Northeast. So starting with cotton in Arizona, cotton and apples and potatoes, for that matter, have historically been some of the most pesticide-intensive crops. So lots of applications made because there's so many pests out there that enjoy feeding on those plants. And so in Arizona, in the 90s, cotton growers were spraying 9 times during the year. And now it's much less than that. It's dropped to 1 or 2 sprays a year, and sometimes none, by taking a holistic approach. And what the team did in Arizona, they were faced with this horrible infestation of whiteflies, which are these tiny insects that suck sap from cotton plants and other plants as well. And if you get too many of them, they can weaken the plant and damage the crop. They can also attack ornamental plants in the landscape too. And there were just clouds of these things in Arizona that required these multiple pesticide applications to control so that you'd have cotton to harvest at the end of the season. So the team there in Arizona really took a multi-pronged approach and looked at all the elements of the system to see what they could take advantage of and improve to lower the pest pressure and reduce the reliance on pesticides. And so one of the things that they did was looked at the beneficials that controlled whitefly, this devastating pest that was had skyrocketing populations there and was driving much of the pesticide use, and looked for pesticide options that would preserve the beneficials, that weren't toxic to the beneficials of whiteflies. They looked at timing, so when can we avoid applying pesticides so that we protect those beneficials? And they also developed some techniques for pink bollworm where they were using pheromones, which are chemicals that are produced by organisms for different purposes. And so they used a synthetic mimic of the pheromone that the pink bollworm female puts out to attract males for mating, and they would flood the fields with that pheromone and prevent mating from happening. They also released sterile males, and so when they would mate with the females, the female would think things were fine and dandy and go ahead and lay their eggs, but they wouldn't hatch and develop into plant-eating caterpillars because the males were sterile. And incredibly, they were able to eradicate that pest from areas of Arizona and also Mexico as well, because those approaches were so successful in suppressing the population. So it's been a great success story. And one of the techniques that they introduced, which really speaks to the social aspect, is that they have a website now where growers, if they need to spray, they can go onto this website and see what neighbors in their county are using for pesticides to help make sure that not everybody is using the same pesticide and that there are different modes of action of pesticides out there being used to delay development of resistance. So it's really a very multifaceted, looking at the whole system and taking advantage of lots of different approaches so that growers can have successful cotton crops with very little pesticide. So I can move on to the apple example, unless you've got a question for me.
Yeah, please do.
So after managing an apple orchard in Virginia for a couple of years, I really got interested in the pest management aspects. And I'd been out of high school for about 6 years and decided to go to college and learn more about it. And at that time, the University of Massachusetts had received one of the first federal grants to develop an IPM program, in this case for apples in the region. So I ended up going to school up in Massachusetts and working in that program. And there, essentially, our goal was to convert the system to an IPM approach. So to move away from that calendar-based approach, this is your calendar, and on, July 1st, you're going to be spraying this insecticide and this fungicide, to an approach that was really based on what was happening in the field. And one of the things that happened while I was there was that this apparently new pest came into the region called the apple blotch leaf miner. And it was a tiny moth that growers really hadn't seen before. And all of a sudden, there were thousands of them in the orchards. So this moth lays its egg on the underside of an apple leaf. When the egg hatches, this caterpillar tunnels into the leaf, and it makes a mine in between the upper and lower layers of the leaf and develops in there, feeding on initially plant sap and then actually devouring plant cells. So by the time it completes its development, you have this mine. You have a spot where you can actually look through the leaf and see out the other side, because the leaf miner has consumed all that plant tissue. And what was happening was these things were reaching such high numbers that by the end of the season, the trees looked like somebody took a blowtorch to them. They had so many mines, and the apples were dropping before they were becoming ripe and the growers could harvest them. So it was devastating to put all that effort into developing the crop and then not be able to harvest it at the end of the season. And so what we discovered was that this insect, you could go out in the woods and find a wild apple tree, and you'd find a handful of mines, as opposed to the huge numbers that we're seeing in commercial apple orchards. What we discovered was this repeated use of broadly toxic pesticides was controlling the beneficials in the commercial orchards, but this moth had developed resistance to the pesticides we were using, and so was completely out of control. So the pesticides weren't controlling it, and the natural enemies that controlled it in wild trees weren't controlling it either, because we were killing them. So we started with some basic IPM techniques. So how do we monitor for this insect? And we found that covering a red piece of plastic with a clear sticky material was a great trap that we could use, so that growers could start trapping early in the season. And we developed a threshold that they could use to decide whether they needed to treat to control those populations early. There was a team that was working on pesticide options that would be effective against the moth and not harm the beneficials, and timings for those pesticide applications to preserve those beneficials. And within just a couple of years, we were back on top of that problem. So that's a good example of a team approach focusing on very specific techniques for a specific pest. And we were doing that for multiple pests in that program, such that by the end of the 5-year program, our IPM growers were spraying half as much as the non-IPM growers, and we were getting better fruit because we really knew what we were doing. We knew what the pests were that we needed to manage, and we knew the right techniques to make sure that those were under control. So we were getting better quality and higher yields of the apple at a lower cost because we're using a lot less pesticide. And then thinking holistically over a number of years, we continue to work with this group of growers, and we've had this ongoing program now since 2004 called Eco Apple. So one of the problems that our growers faced was that they were losing access to wholesale markets like supermarkets. So in the Northeast, we can only grow apples during the growing season, and the harvest comes in the fall, and many growers would be selling their crop in the fall and trying to sell that crop as quickly as possible so they could move on to getting ready for the next season and pruning the trees and so forth. And that didn't really work for the supermarkets, who have to have a year-round supply of apples. So larger sellers were coming into the market with access to apples from New Zealand and South America, and signing contracts with these supermarkets to provide this year-round supply, and our apple growers were losing access to those buyers. And so we developed this Eco Apple program, which is a certification program where we have a protocol that we follow, and includes all of those IPM elements that we talked about, the monitoring techniques. And in order to get certified and sell their apples as Eco Apples, growers are using all of these IPM techniques, and they're also doing things like conserving water, reducing electricity consumption, all the things that consumers care about and want to support with their purchasing dollars. And so we have this Eco Apple program now that also promotes the idea that by buying Eco Apples, you can keep farms and farmers in the landscape, because consumers in New England don't want to see those farms disappear and be replaced by houses or whatever else might develop to replace agriculture if agriculture is no longer profitable for growers in the Northeast. So it's really a great example of starting from conventional scheduled pesticide applications and developing that IPM system over time very holistically, so that we're addressing issues like access to supermarkets in the Northeast for our apple growers.
Great. It seems like we've got a pretty good thing going and started here with the infrastructure to communicate these programs, and obviously the need and desire to expand them, some of those pilot programs. So as part of that, where do you see kind of the future of IPM, holistic IPM? Like, what are the next steps for people who use these practices, new types of practices? Where are we going with this whole approach?
Well, so it's important to realize that we are always evolving these programs. One of the drivers are changes in pests. So we have new pests that get introduced from other countries, for example, or new pests that come along and they've mutated in some way that now allows them to access a particular crop that they didn't do well in before. So there's always that evolution going on and reaction to changes in things in the environment that we have to develop new IPM techniques and systems for. So certainly that is an ongoing process that's happening. We're designing a project ourselves in regenerative agriculture, working with General Mills and other food companies to learn what's happening in these pilots and to take that to additional crops as well, and also very specifically to learn what are the business opportunities for ag retailers and CCAs in regenerative agriculture. Right now, there are a number of consultants that are traveling large distances to work with growers in these pilots. And certainly that's a role that CCAs can play locally with their farmers. Should we develop some successful models here, we need those CCAs to be front and center in terms of providing that support to farmers who want to take this approach. So our project is very focused on that and working with CCAs as part of these pilots and helping all of us learn how they can be effective and profitable in their role working with those farmers.
Excellent. That sounds like some great programs and great areas to grow in. We've got 3 questions left for you today. The first one is, if listeners want to learn more about these topics, where can they go?
So I mentioned this book, Beyond IPM, that Juan Barrera wrote, and certainly it would be a great book for CCAs to read. It's very readable and a great resource for designing and implementing holistic approaches. So it can really help you wrap your head around this holistic approach and think about ways that you might, in your work, think about pest problems more holistically and be more successful in getting farmers to adopt IPM techniques that help you out as well in terms of having successful crops. There's also a couple other resources that I wanted to point out. We've been working over the past 10 years with organic leaders in the country. We formed a working group back in 2014, and few people realize that IPM is a big part of organic. So organic growers are required to use a number of IPM techniques in order to earn their certification. And certainly IPM practitioners and organic experts share common goals around optimizing health and environment. So we started working together, and there's a white paper that's located on the working group website. So if you Google Organic and IPM Working Group and go to the resources page, you'll see this Organic and IPM white paper that goes through the history of IPM and organic, which is very interesting, and then talks about how we can work together. And certainly organic is a holistic approach and includes that market-based element that EcoApples is pursuing as well, that certification. So that's an interesting read. And then finally, also on that resources page, there's a fact sheet on regenerative agriculture that I described. General Mills and others are working to promote. And so that's just a 2-page fact sheet that's on that website, the Organic and IPM Working Group website, that would be of interest.
Great. Those are some wonderful resources. We will include links to all of those in our show notes. Second question for you is, if people want to then take that next step to get involved in these IPM issues, where can they go and what can they do for that?
Great. So there are things that people can do. So any listener is an eater and they're a food buyer, and they can support farmers who are doing the right things to protect health and environment. And there are multiple certifications that can help consumers identify those farmers and products. So I mentioned EcoApple, and then also Certified Organic, certainly, but also Rainforest Alliance, and you'll see that label on many tropical products like coffee, for example, and bananas. It's a big IPM component to that program. Protected Harvest is another certification program that's big in California wine grapes, for example. True Earth is a program that's modeled after EcoApple, and we've got 20-some apple growers in the upper Midwest growing to the True Earth certified protocol. So people can look for that label as well. There are others out there as well. And that's been a big focus for our organization, is market-based approaches. So working with food companies to help them work with their supply chain practically, so that they develop programs that work for both them and for farmers to address these pressures that they're under from consumers and advocates. So Companies like General Mills, Smucker's, Frontier Spice Co-op are just some of the companies that are working very hard to address those concerns and making good progress. So just because a farmer or a farm product is not certified certainly doesn't mean the farmer's not doing the right things. Certification is a tool that makes it easier for buyers to tell. And then also websites. If you look on company websites, they all have sustainability programs that they're talking about, and many of them touch on what they're doing in the pest management arena. And then I also wanted to mention for people working to address pest problems in their home or their place of work, we developed Green Shield Certified, which is a certification to look for if you're trying to solve a mouse problem, for example, or a cockroach problem, or bed bugs. Green Shield Certified is a very rigorous program where we go out and evaluate companies on site, and we certify them for the practices that they have in place. So our Green Shield companies, there are about 40 of them around the country, are really top-notch. And at the head of their industry for IPM. And then also, it's really important that we all support public funding for IPM research, including IPM techniques that are used in organic system. It's really important that we continue to invest public dollars in IPM. So many of our IPM tactics are techniques, for example. They're not a product that can be bought and sold and earn revenue to pay for product development research. So we need those public funds to put into research that's not necessarily going to develop into an outcome that can be sold and generate revenue. That's so important. And so when you have an opportunity to support your land-grant university, for example, or have a conversation or send a note to your legislator, you can let them know how important IPM and organic systems are to you, and that they're deserving of your tax dollars to continue this research and to continue to improve the systems that we're using now and to put us in a position to address those constant changes that we're having to deal with new pests and changes in circumstances.
Great. Those are some excellent tips and pointers for people who want to get involved. And then our final question for you is, what is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was this podcast or your research or your website?
Oh, I guess something that's very timely is that I love to sail. I'm a sailor. Love to sail with my family and friends and with my dog, Sebastian. And I'm currently talking to you from Turks and Caicos. So I retired from my longtime role directing the IPM Institute this year, and we bought an old 46-foot sailing catamaran built in 1990. And last winter, we sailed it from Florida through the Bahamas, and it now sits in Turks and Caicos. And I hope to be sailing much of the winter down here in the Caribbean on that boat with friends and family. And in the summer, we sail our 1992 Catalina 22-foot sailboat on Lake Mendota in Madison, where the Agronomy Society is based. And I'm very fortunate to have a wife who loves to sail and also a dog who loves to sail. And Sebastian is such an enthusiastic sailor that much like he'll bark at me if I'm late with one of his meals, or if he wants to go for a walk, he will also bark if he wants to go for a sail. So he'll take a look out and see the wind blowing and turn around and look at me and bark and say, "Hey, let's go for a sail." So.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. What kind of dog is Sebastian?
He's a terrier mix. He's about 20 pounds and about knee high and has a lot of personality. And he's just been a wonderful companion now for 11 years. And I have friends whose dogs don't enjoy sailing, so I feel very fortunate that I ended up with a rescue dog who loves to sail.
Oh, that's very sweet. Well, that's so wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the show. It has been a delight, and we have learned a lot. So thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Abby. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. This podcast is sponsored by the Kellogg Company. Kellogg is committed to reach 1 million farmers and workers globally by the end of 2030 with programs that support resilient farmers, communities, and ecosystems. The opinions shared on this podcast are independent from our sponsor. You'll find links to today's resources in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Stitcher, or anywhere else you find your podcasts if you like our show. We're also available on Lyceum, the world's first audio learning community, where you can join our discussion group and comment on each episode. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by guests are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.